Do fossil sequences support Darwinian evolution? Well, hello again. It is Ken Coulson from Creation Unfolding, and we are back with part 2 in this 3-part series on do fossil sequences support Darwinian evolution. So by way of reminder, you'll have to go back and watch part 1. There's a ton of content there that you may have missed. But basically what we did is we looked at the skeletons on the left here, which are dinosaurian skeletons. So top left, so here is Anchiornis, here is Archaeopteryx, and here is Sinosauropteryx. And Sinosauropteryx, this one down the bottom, that is a theropod dinosaur. Everybody agrees, in talking about in creationism, that that is a theropod dinosaur. And the two at the top there are flying dinosaurs. So they had feathers and they were capable of powered flight. And in the last part, we talked about the evolution of flight and the feather. And we talked about how some creationists are wanting to call these two critters up the top here birds. And so I've got actual birds over here on the right. It's a chicken and that's a crow. And I suggested that that is not a good idea. Yes, it's okay to call something a bird in the sense of using a folk taxonomy. If you want to call it a bird, that's fine. But you can't sort of undefine it as a dinosaur. And the reason we can't do that is because we never set the rules. The evolutionary community defined what a dinosaur is, and so if we as creationists want to use the term dinosaur, then we need to defer to the definition that they've already set. We can't decide that something's not a dinosaur anymore. And they defined a dinosaur, a theropod dinosaur, as having a particular kind of skeleton. And when you look at these skeletons, the skeleton of Anchiornis, Archaeopteryx, and Sinosauropteryx, you don't have to be an evolutionist. You don't have to be a scientist to see that these skeletons are definitely all more like each other than they are to the skeletons of the birds over here. These two top skeletons we would define as being more dinosaur-like, clearly more dinosaur-like, and so we really should be calling them dinosaurs. If you want to call them birds, that's fine, but you can't sort of uncall them dinosaurs. That definition has been set by the secular scientific community. This is a dinosaur, and therefore, based on the skeletons of these two, we would have to call these dinosaurs as well, although they were flying dinosaurs, and I'm not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that they evolved from non-flying dinosaurs. This is all about classification, and we looked at that in part 1. Go back, please watch that to get some context. And we also looked at the end of part 1 that essentially you've got these two groups. You've got birds on the right, what we would kind of classify as a bird, and you've got these dinosaurs on the left, which include land-based and flying-based dinosaurs. And I've got that big no transition sign in there because at this point we're only talking about the evolution of flight and the feather. But today I want to talk about the whole gamut, the evolution of the bird from dinosaurs. And so, or at least the secular interpretation on that. And if I was an evolutionist and I was hypothesizing that indeed the birds on the right came from the flying theropods on the left, then I would hypothesize that there should be some kind of transition in there. In fact, there should be lots and lots of transitions that unite these two groups. And although it's not as clear as that, there certainly isn't a nice sequence, there are some transitions that creationists need to deal with. So here, for example, is a skeleton of an avian. It's in a group called avialans, and it is called Confuciusornis. Now, what's interesting about this particular critter when you look at it, yes, it definitely looks like a bird. So that's why I've got it over towards the right with the birds, because the skeleton certainly looks a lot like a bird. But there are a lot of characteristics that the skeleton has which are like the dinosaurs on the left. And there is definitely a distinction between them. So you can see that the Confuciusaurus has the 3 fingers on its manus, or on its hand. So digits 1, 2, and 3, just like the dinosaurs on the left. While the birds on the right have the fused metacarpals, or carpal and metacarpals are fused into that carpa metacarpus bone, which is very, very distinct in modern birds. There are other differences as well. It has the gastralia, like the dinosaurs do, to the left. However, it has the pygostyle, like the birds do on the right. So in general, I think that the Confuciusaurus, and especially when we have a look at a picture of it, so here's kind of an artist's rendition of what Confuciusaurus looked like. I mean, it looks like a bird when you have a look at it. And so I think it belongs more on the bird side of that barrier that I've got there, no transitions. But I could see why an evolutionist might say, well, hang on a minute, there's a lot of characters that this skeleton has that look a lot like dinosaurs, and so I'm going to call that a transition. And so I get that, and as creationists, if we're going to be honest and humble with the data, we can certainly see why an evolutionist might make that interpretation. Okay, so what I want to do here is we're looking at the whole gamut of bird evolution, and I'm going to go into a little bit of depth to describe how and why an evolutionist holds their views and how we might interpret that as creationists. So what we're looking at here is a cladogram. And a cladogram is an evolutionary way of describing where our modern group came from. So if you have a look at this, is a massive cladogram. I've actually pieced it together from a whole bunch of Wikipedia small cladograms. And we end up over here at the bottom, this group here called Ornitherae. Ornitherae contains what we think of when we talk about modern birds. All of the other names on this huge cladogram here, all of these other taxa are now extinct. They don't exist anymore. All of the living descendants of so-called descendants of the theropods are actually now found in this group, Ornitherae. And that's where we're going. We're going to that group, and where we're coming from is right over here on the left. We're starting with this group over here, the Compsognathids. That's the group that the evolutionary community think from out of that group came the group that eventually led to birds. So to begin with, to make it a little easier, I'm going to black out the rest of it, and we're going to start on the left with our tiny little cladogram, which starts with Compsognathids. And so Compsognathids are a group of very basal or basic theropod dinosaurs. In fact, Sinosauropteryx is a Compsognathid. And from the evolutionary perspective, modern birds evolved out of this group. So think about a group of these little dinosaurs, had really no specific features in common with birds except perhaps for hollow bones. And these creatures, from this group of Compsognathids, a small group migrated away and began to evolve, and that small group evolved feathers. And that little group were called Maniraptoriforms. And so that's what this group is here. So this cladogram is showing that you have a group evolving out of this group, and they're called Maniraptoriforms. Now notice there were lots of other theropod dinosaurs, okay, that went on their merry way evolving, but they're sort of evolutionary dead ends when it comes to flight, so we're not interested in those groups. We're interested in the group that leads to birds, and that's this one. And I think a really important and interesting way to think of cladograms is in terms of Russian nesting dolls. So we've all seen the Russian nesting dolls, where you have like a big Russian nesting doll, and you open the top up and there's a whole bunch of other little Russian nesting dolls inside. And that's kind of the way it is with these cladograms. think about each one of these groups clicking on it like it was a link, and it opens up and it shows you a whole bunch of other groups, okay? And that's what we're going to do. So we click on this and we end up with another cladogram that's connected to this one. And so all of these represent this group called Maniraptoriforms. So they are theropods, but they all had feathers. Now, importantly, from the evolutionary perspective, none of these critters flew, and they simply evolved feathers for other reasons, maybe for thermoregulation, maybe to shelter their young, whatever. They have lots of different interpretations on that. But anyway, what we were interested in here is this group, Maniraptora. We're not interested in any of the others because from an evolutionary perspective, they're sort of, or at least from a flight perspective, they're evolutionary dead ends. They don't go anywhere. And we're trying to follow the evolution of the bird, and that is found in this group. If I wanted to find out something else about, I don't know, this group right here, then I'd click on it and I'd end up with another cladogram, and they'd be going elsewhere. Now, eventually, however, all of these will go extinct. Their descendants will eventually go extinct anyway. This is the only group that sort of continues on in the evolutionary thinking. So we've got this group Maniraptora. So I click on it, and now that gives me these two main groups here, Deinonychosauria and Aviale. And the Deinonychosaurians you may be familiar with. We've already looked at those. So we have Anchiornis here, which belongs in the group Dromaeosauridae, although it has also been put into the top group here, Archaeopterygidae. We've got Archaeopteryx at the top, which belongs definitely in that group. And this is Velociraptor, and Velociraptor belongs in the Dromaeosaur group here as well. So Deinonychosauria is defined as a group of feathered theropods. Some could fly, some could not, but they're more like Velociraptor. They're more like the Dromaeosaurs than anything else. That's what defines them. So that's the group Deinonychosauria. Now, interestingly, there does seem to be sort of a barrier, okay, between that group and everything else that we're going to look at to the right of the green line. So everything we've looked at so far, including the group Deinonychosauria, we would classify all of those as dinosaurs, and we've already seen why, because they all have sort of a skeleton that looks like this, very dinosaurian. And so we would classify them as dinosaurs, whether they had feathers, whether they flew, because we're classifying not according to feathers and flight, we're classifying them according to their bone structure, and their bone structure is dinosaurian. So that's why we would classify them as dinosaurs and not birds. And this kind of separation between this group on the left and the group that we're going to look at on the right has also been discussed by creationists. So there's this paper that was published by McLean, Petrone, and Spites in 2018. It was a baraminology study on theropods and on avialans, which we're going to look at next. And even that paper agreed that there was definitely a big discontinuity between the dinosaurian animals on the left of that green line and what we would think of more like birds on the right-hand side of the line. This is what they said. These results agree with what was previously reported by Garner et al. They found strong evidence for discontinuity between non-avialan theropods and avialans. And let me go back. That means this group, these are non-avialan theropods, even though some of them flew, and these are avialans. Okay, so let's look now at this group here, these avialans. Okay, so the group avialans, this is where we got that skeleton earlier. Remember, we talked about Confuciusornis, and we said it's sort of a transition between the theropods and between modern birds, although I said I think it was a little bit more like the birds than it is like the theropods, so it's not an exact transition that should be right in the middle. So that is an avialan. So the avialans had a lot of skeletal parts that were in common with both birds and dinosaurs. And you can see, again, looking at the artist's representation here of Confuciusaurus, has those 3 claws. Okay, it doesn't have those fused carpals and metacarpals like modern birds do, so it's very distinctive. It has teeth, it has gastralia, and a few other bits and pieces as well that sort of show that it has commonality with the theropods on the left. But when you look at these critters, without using any technical paleontological terms or phylogenetics or anything, you can sort of see these things look like birds. Okay, and so that's I think important to see that there is sort of a gap right here between these theropod-like things, these dinosaur-like things on the left, and these other avialan things on the right. Okay, so now what we're interested in here, remember this is a group Aviali, there's a whole bunch of taxa in here, but we're interested in this group right here called Ornithothraces. All of the rest of these taxa go extinct. They go on their merry way evolving, but they are, from a flight perspective, they're evolutionary dead ends. They don't go anywhere, and again we're following the evolutionary, or at least assumed evolutionary sequence for birds. Okay, so Ornithothraces. So we click on that, and so here now we've got another cladogram that's opened up over here. Again, think Russian nesting dolls. I click on this group, and I have these other groups that open to the right. Now, Ornithothraces means literally bird thorax. That's what this means. And the idea is that this group to the right here have strong sternums, breastbones, have keels, and things that we really see strongly in modern birds. So the other groups, these avialans, although they had breastbones and things like that, they apparently weren't as robust as the groups on the right. And so that's why this group are called Ornithothraces. Okay, so now in this group, Ornithothraces, there are 2 groups of importance called the Enantiornithines and the Ornithorines. Now in this particular cladogram, you've got a couple of other little groups before you get to Ornithorines right down here. But I am going to include all of these here. I'm going to put all of these in the Ornithorine group, because you've got this Ornithoromorpha, and honestly I couldn't see a great deal of difference between the Ornithoromorpha and the Ornithorines. I think they're so close to each other. So for the sake of simplicity, I am going to put them all in the group. So you've got 2 groups here. This group, Enantiornithines, and all of these, and I'm going to just call these Ornithorines. And it's from this group that we get what we would call modern birds, like crows and chickens and things like that. Okay, so let's have a look. Enantiornithines. Again, if you click on that, you get all of these different taxa that open up. Here is one example of one of these Enantiornithines, Iberomysonus, and essentially when you're looking at this, yes, you're thinking to yourself, that's a bird. And for all intents and purposes, yes, I would call that a bird. You can see that it has the fused carpal and metacarpals. That is very distinct of birds, and so that's very common, and it's the same in modern birds today. It still has teeth, and it still has either 1 or a few claws on its hand, but apart from that, it's very similar to what we would call modern birds. Now, the reason these are called enantiornithines, they have that word anti is in there. It literally means opposite birds, and that's because these enantiornithines had a slightly different way in which the scapula and the coracoid bones got together. So and I don't know which way it is, but if one bone's the scapula and one bone is the coracoid, as they come together, the facets, the end pieces of the bones, as they touch, they're slightly different in the 2 different kinds of birds, Enantiornithines and Ornithorines, or the group down here. The Enantiornithines, let's just say this was let's say this was the scapula. Let's say it had a convex end on it, which would mean the coracoid would have to have a corresponding concave end in order to match. In the group Ornithorines, it's the other way around. So this would have the convex end, and the scapula would have a concave end. That's it. That's the big difference, and it's for that reason that these are called enantiornithines. In fact, they didn't even pick that up, paleontologists, for a long time, and just thought the whole group was very similar to the ornithorine group. But then someone said, hey, look, the way these bones are connected is different in this group. Okay, so that's the enantiornithines, and again, they're all extinct. We don't have any of these critters alive. We want to go down to this group because, according again to the evolutionary community, it's from this group that modern birds evolved. And there are a couple of examples over here. There's this one here, Tnu ornis, and this one here as well, Hongshen ornis. And for all intents and purposes, these are just like modern birds. The biggest difference between them and, say, a crow would be that these still had teeth in their jaws. That's really the only difference that between these two birds that we're looking at right here and, say, a crow is teeth in the jaws. So for all intents and purposes, a very modern bird. Here's kind of a blow-up picture. So here's an enantiornithine, and these are both of these are ornithorines, and are at least close enough to ornithorines. They actually belong in that group Ornithoromorpha, but they're close enough. And you can see, looking at them, they're essentially birds in every respect. Okay, so let's go here. So now I've got an enantiornithine in here, the skeleton of one. That's Cathay ornis. And just to show that indeed the enantiornithines, and of course the ornithorines, which are these are actually again modern birds, which are inside ornithorines. But all of these together, you can see these skeletons are all very, very bird-like. They belong strictly to the right, unlike our avialand, Confuciusornis here, that skeleton, which you can see why it would be leaning more over to the left and closer to the theropod dinosaurs. But as I said earlier, there is definitely a distinction between all of these and all of these over here, and I think that's important. But one other thing that I wanted to emphasize. So Ornithorae, that's what these two birds here are, ornithorines. If we clicked on this group, then we would open up another set of Russian nesting dolls, and we would end up with two groups called Neognathus and Paleognathus, and it's in those two groups that we find modern birds. All modern birds come from these two groups called Paleognathus and Neognathus. So keep that in mind. So now what we want to do is we want to look at all of these different critters and have a look at this from a creationist, a fossil perspective, and from a creationist perspective. So here are all these critters we looked at. Here are some of the main players. We have Sinosauropteryx. This is the Compsognathids, supposedly the group from which all modern birds evolved. Then we have here we have Velociraptor. So it didn't fly, but it had feathers. We've got Anchiornis and Archaeopteryx, so they had feathers and flew. Then we've got Confuciusornis, and remember we said there was kind of a big discontinuity gap here, and that these groups over here on the right are certainly, you saw those, we would say they're birds, whilst these are not. And so we've got Confuciusornis, again, still has a lot of dinosaurian features, but also has a lot of bird features. Enantiornithines, and then these are ornithorines, and then we get to this would be a Neognathus. This would be a crow. It's in that group, Neognathus. And of course, all of these are extant, meaning they are still alive. So you've got a whole bunch of Neognaths and Paleognaths, but all of these are extinct. We don't have any of them. And if I was an evolutionist, I could see why someone might believe in the evolution of the bird. I mean, you have a look at this, and there does seem to be sort of a sequence here. There seems to be some kind of continuity. And if I accepted that, then I would also want to see that same continuity in the fossil record, and that's very, very important. Now, the red lines here represent the range. In other words, how long the organism has lived. The bottom of the red line is the most important piece of information here. It has to do with when that particular organism evolved, when it comes onto the scene, or at least when we find it in the fossil record. Okay, and so that's the most important piece of information. The range, although it has some interesting pieces of information in it, we're not going to take much notice of that. So I've given here an ideal fossil sequences. And that is, since we know that compsognathids, from an evolutionary perspective, evolved first, well, we would expect to find it first in the fossil record. And we would expect to find the thing that has evolved feathers a little bit higher up in the fossil record. And we would expect to find the dinosaur that flies a little bit higher up in the fossil record, and so on and so forth. And I think that's a pretty cogent, cohesive way of looking at it. That's exactly what we should find. We should find the next evolved critter just a little bit higher up in the fossil record. Again, don't worry too much about what happens with the range, the top of the line, but where they start is important. We should sort of see a step ladder, something that looks something like that. Because according to evolution, and especially the evolution of flight feathers, we're talking about a very, very complex component in the supposed evolutionary story, and it's something that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take, from an evolutionary perspective, we're talking tens of millions of years for this to happen. And so we would expect to find the fossils in this sequence. But what do we find? Well, this is actually what we find. Now, I do have the ranges for each of these fossil taxa here as well, which is interesting in and of itself. But what I want to focus on is where they start. Notice that you have here Sinosauropteryx, and this actually, Sinosauropteryx is in that Compsognathid group. Compsognathidea have a fossil beginnings sometime in the late Jurassic, around 155, 152 million years ago. Something like that is where they supposedly start. And it's from that group, remember, that we get the next in the evolutionary sequence, which is the Velociraptor. And so the Velociraptor has slightly more bird-like features. It has feathers, fully formed, a lot of fully formed feathers, but it couldn't fly. And so this would be the next stage in the evolution sequence. And surely enough, yes, you can see it does come in line where it's supposed to. It sits, I think it's around 130 million years ago. And so that's about 20 million years later than the Compsognathids. So it fits in the sequence. It's a little bit higher. But then you get to Anchiornis, and something weird happens, because Anchiornis is a flying, at least an apparently flying theropod dinosaur that had the ability of powered flight, and it sits in the fossil record at 163 million years ago. So this is incredible, because this is 15 million years before the group from which it supposedly evolved. So here's the Compsognathids, and then here's this flying theropod at 163 million years ago. And so that's problematic from a fossil perspective. And in fact, this was the point that I brought up in part 1, because this is supposedly a fully flying theropod dinosaur, and yet we don't find a single feather in the fossil record before that point. You would expect to find the transitions for feathered flight. Flight from feathers should be there in the fossil record, but it's not. It just appears straight up in the fossil record without any precursors, at least the feathers, from feathered flight, powered flight perspective. And that's really, really important from a creationist perspective. Okay, and then an Archaeopteryx is kind of similar. It's around 150 million years ago, something like that. So it actually appears at the same time as its supposed ancestor. So these groupings here, these first four, don't fit in the evolutionary story. They don't fit from a evolution of flight perspective and the feather for sure, and they don't fit just in the general scheme of things about where things should turn up in the fossil record. But when you get over here to the right, these sort of do fit a little bit into the evolutionary scheme. So what we've got here is Confuciusornis, and we've got the Enantiornithines and the Ornithorines, and here is Neonathus, which is the modern, one of the modern birds in that modern group. And when you look at it, you can see that these ones, okay, they do sit a little bit higher than the Velociraptor. And so these are around 125 million years ago, something like that. Of course, I'm using the secular timeline. And so they sit just a little bit high. Now, I think you would expect them to be a little bit higher than that, but they do sit a little bit higher. I think what is interesting, though, is that they all turn up at the same time. They all turn up at the exact same time. And one of the reasons that is that a lot of these birds, these avialans, these enantiornithines, and these ornithorines, they all turn up in the Yixian Formation of China, and we're going to talk about that shortly. There's just hundreds and hundreds of these fossils, excellent specimens. And so most of these critters are described from that formation, which is dated at 125 million years ago from a secular perspective. But what's interesting is they just all turn up in that formation, all together. Even the difference between an avialan, which is supposedly a very, very primitive bird or advanced theropod dinosaur, whichever way you want to look at it, to an ornithorine, and yet there they are in the same, or almost the same layers. So that's pretty interesting. Now, this one's definitely in line with an evolutionary story, because the modern groups, the neonaths and the paleonaths, do appear right at the top of the Mesozoic. It's a huge gap here, and that's probably where you would expect to find them. Okay, so now we want to have a look at, this from a creationist perspective. Well, we've already sort of unpacked that a little bit. Certainly what we're looking at doesn't quite fit the evolutionary story, but it doesn't quite fit the creationist story either. I think essentially you're going to go with whatever you want to believe. Whatever your current bias is, that's probably the way that you might interpret the data. So it's really sort of ambiguous at the moment. But I do want to talk about this. This is a paper that was published in 1995. And for those of you who are in any way interested in paleontology, it will be very interesting, because it says Confuciusornis sanctus, a new late Jurassic bird from China. Well, that's kind of interesting, because we know now that Confuciusornis is not late Jurassic, it's actually an early Cretaceous bird. So what's going on? And this is really, really interesting, and it opened a huge can of worms for me. It has to do with the dating of the Yixian Formation, in fact of the whole set of formations from where all of these fossil birds here came from. Confuciusornis came from the Yixian Formation, but back in the mid-90s, it was actually dated 20 million years older and was put into the late Jurassic, which is really interesting. So let's have a look at what happened, what's going on. So here's a map of China, and the shaded part here, so here's China, here's Korea, okay, here's Japan, just to give you an idea of the size of this grayed out area. That grayed out area represents a bunch of lacustrine or lake deposits that represent what's called the J-hole biota. And this is a bunch of insects and plants, but also a lot of vertebrates, and a lot of theropods, feather theropods, and birds that have been found in this J-hole biota, mostly being found in this area called Liaoning in China. That's where most of them are actually found. But this is really interesting. So you've got in Liaoning the most famous formations that represent the J-hole biota are called the J-hole group, and they are made up of the Yixian Formation. I've got a little map here, the Jiufatong Formation, so here it is here, the Yishan Formation right there, and this one here, the Jiufatang Formation. These two, here's the J-hole group. It actually includes two more formations on top, but it's these two here where most, most of these fossils of these feathered dinosaurs, avialans, enantiornithines, and ornithorines, they're all found in these two formations. Now, all of these other formations that you see to the right are actually correlated formations that follow the J-hole biota, or follow the J-hole sedimentary deposits across China, both to the west and to the south. So although you have a formation, let's say called the Yishan Formation here, they don't call it the Yishan Formation all the way across or all the way down. What happens is the Yishan Formation kind of dovetails into another formation, and it's got a different name depending on the area. So the formations are typically named on some town or area that it's close to. And the same with these other formations, they're also named according to their locations. So that means what you end up with, if you want to correlate the formations right across China, then you end up with something like this. So here's the Yishan Formation, and that would be in Liaoning. But then as you travel, for example, this one's going further north and slightly east, you end up with these other formations which correlate to this one, but they have different names. And that's the case right across both eastern China and southern China. You've got all of these formations here. And a lot of these formations, they have found some of the fossils that go into this J-hole biota. However, most of them have been found in these two formations here. Okay, so hopefully you've gotten all of that. Now what's interesting is that the Yishan Formation, this one is the most important out of all of them. It originally was thought to be a late Jurassic deposit. And so this actual stratigraphic section that I've got here is from a paper that was published in 1991 by Chinese authors. And in that paper, that's the way they've described the Yishan Formation. They've described it as late Jurassic. Now, of course, at this stage, a lot of these feathered dinosaurs had not been discovered. They didn't get discovered until the mid-90s. So these feathered dinosaurs and birds, they hadn't found any of them yet. This particular paper is just looking at insects, for example. But later they found a lot of these other deposits. But what's interesting is, in that paper, they have some absolute dates for some of the formations associated, well, of the Yishan Formation and associated with the Yishan Formation. And here's a date of 143 million years. Now, now the Yishan Formation is dated at 125 or 120 to 25 million years. So it's about 20 million years younger now than it was back in the mid-90s. Now, you're also probably thinking to yourself, if you know anything about the geologic column, you're probably thinking, hang on a minute, 143 million years still doesn't put it into the Jurassic, because the boundary is at 145 million years. But that is a very modern conception. It's a more modern conception. In China at that time, they put the Jurassic Cretaceous boundary somewhere at about 135 million years ago. And that just confuses things even more. So, for example, here's a paper that was published in 2022, so just last year. And this discussion is still ongoing. Okay, notice what it says. In recent years, research on the terrestrial Jurassic Cretaceous boundary in the Jibei Laoshi region, so that's the region around Liaoning where these J-hole biota are found, has experienced major progress, but the definition of both the boundary and its age limit is still controversial. And then next, I'll read this. A number of Chinese scientists have argued that the Jurassic Cretaceous boundary is difficult to correlate directly with the international marine standards based on terrigenous stratigraphic data, and they have proposed the use of 135 or 137 million years ago. Chen placed the Jurassic Cretaceous boundary between the Yishan and Jiufatang formations and recommends a boundary age of 125 million years ago. These are very different than the 145 million mark that's used in most of the world today. And so I don't fully understand all the implications of this, but there are, even today, major issues with where to put the boundary in this area. That's the first issue. The second issue is actually with the dates themselves. So, as I said, this was a published radiometric date at the time of 143 million years for the Evian formation, and all these other dates, the ones that are not in brackets, are the original dates. 130 million years for the Fuxin, 127 million years for this one, 143 million years for the Huangjian, and 152 million years for the Dabe Go. So all of these, the ones that I have numbers on, are actually absolute dates that they had at the time in 1991. So they had 5 absolute dates of both the Evian formation and some of the surrounding formations. But something happened in the mid to late 90s. So as I said, originally it was thought to be mid to late Jurassic, and then in the mid to late 90s they changed, or wanted to change, the age on these formations, and a lot of it had to do with the biostratigraphy that was in those formations. So here is a paper that was published in 1999, this is when they were really starting to switch from an older age for the Evian formation to a newer or a less old age. And so this is what it says. Looking at the vertebrate fauna, comparison of Sinosauropteryx and Confuciusornis with Compsognathus and Archaeopteryx. Now, Sinosauropteryx and Confuciusornis were both found in the Evian formation, at the bottom of the Evian formation. And remember that it used to be thought that that was late Jurassic. And what they're saying is, look, when you compare Sinosauropteryx and Confuciusornis with Compsognathus and Archaeopteryx, okay, from the Solnhofen limestone of Europe, that's led some workers to argue for late Jurassic. In other words, based on the fossils, the workers are saying, look, this is definitely late Jurassic. And then down the bottom, however, and the occurrence of the ceratopsian dinosaur, Psittacosaurus, have led others to argue for a younger Cretaceous age. And so you've got another group saying, hang on a minute, you've got this other ceratopsian dinosaur in there, and so it's got to belong in the Cretaceous. And so biostratigraphy was definitely driving what a lot of people were saying, despite the fact that they already had absolute dates, lots of them, for these formations. And now let me read this portion here. Isotope dates on volcanics from the Evian formation have not helped to resolve the controversy. Proponents of a Jurassic age for the lower Evian formation refer to potassium-argon date of 137 million years and a rubidium-strontium date of 143 million years. So these guys were really kind of fighting it out back in the mid to late 90s. Now what this paper basically said was look, potassium-argon dates and rubidium-strontium dates, they're not going to work because of some mineralogical issue. I didn't understand what they were talking about, but this is what they were saying. They were saying, look, there was some mineralogical issue, and so that kind of dating is not going to work. We need to use argon to argon dating. That's what they were saying. That's what we need to use. That's what we did, and we came up with a date of 125 million years, and so that's the date that we should be actually using. And by the way, just for those interested, you'll notice for those interested in radioisotope dating pairs, that the rubidium-strontium shows an older age than the potassium-argon, and a lot of creationists have been looking at this. It was an issue in the came up in the RATE project as to why you have radioisotope pairs that are heavier seem to date older. So anyway, for those interested, there's something that you can check out as well. Okay, so this is also from that paper. The new dates reported here, so that's their dates of 125 million years, in conjunction with the results of reference 26, indicate that the feathered dinosaurs of Liaoning, although primitive in appearance, are not late Jurassic or even earliest Cretaceous. given the similarities already noted with the Solnhofen and Liaoning fossils, it would appear that aspects of the terrestrial fauna were part of a long-lived chronofauna persisting across the Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary. In other words, look, yes, they're similar, but guess what? I guess somehow the Sinosauropteryx and these other primitive theropods, they just happen to live for a very, very, very long time. In other words, there was a lot of stasis going on in these groups, because this definitely is not late Jurassic. At least that's what they're trying to tell us. Notice the section that I have highlighted, though, italics. However, the ages of many of these sites worldwide are poorly known, and in light of the new dates for the lower Ishian fauna reported here, their ages may need re-examination. Notice what they're doing. They're saying, look, our dates are right, maybe those dates are off, and you need to go and have a look at them. Okay, so now this issue, it hasn't gotten, I mean, well, now it's actually, I think, resolved amongst a lot of Chinese paleontologists. But it took a while. This is a paper from 2006 talking about some of these chronological issues. So in this paper, they quote the work by Swisher, which we just looked at. They're the people who just said our date, 125 million years, that's the one that we need to have. And the reason they said that was because we need to use the argon to argon system. Well, someone else came along, this guy called Lowe, all right? He came along and said, okay, I'm going to do it using the argon to argon system, and guess what? He came out with a date of 147 million years. Let me read it. The work by Swisher was challenged by Lowe, who reported an age of 147 million years using the argon to argon dating of biotite crystals from a tuff in the lower Ishian formation. So, what's it going to be? Again, so you've got all of these dates that are getting sort of mixed up. Here is another paper that was published just in 2015, again talking about some of these issues. The above mentioned radiometric dates, that's the ones giving Jurassic Cretaceous boundary, that's the age they're giving, 145, from the Tongzhengxi formation, which is actually below the Ishian formation, are inconsistent with their middle to late Jurassic age assignment based on the biostratigraphic evidence. In other words, what you've got going on now is below, let me go back to this, I might have it here somewhere. Here it is. So here is the formation we're talking about. It turns out that a group of people, they dated the same people who were trying to raise the date for the Ishian formation and make it younger. They also dated this one, and they came up with an age of 145 million years. And this author is saying, look, basically I think these dates are okay, but hang on a minute, this can't work down here. And the reason it can't work is because this is absolutely for sure late Jurassic, and the reason he says it's absolutely for sure late Jurassic is based on the biostratigraphic evidence. And he goes into a whole bunch of examples, all sorts of biostratigraphy to say, no, this is late Jurassic for sure, this is not the boundary. Anyway, I've gone through all of that to show this is problematic. This is not just a small issue. There are issues with the actual boundary of the Cretaceous-Jurassic boundary, where it lies. Is it 135 million years ago? Is it 145 million years ago? And then you've got a whole bunch of inconsistent radiometric dates. You've got a whole bunch of inconsistent biostratigraphic data. Now, as I said, now things seem to be resolved. In other words, I guess most people have come on board and have accepted this younger age for the Ishian formation. But considering that there were other radiometric dates made in some of these other formations, all of those radiometric ages were changed as well. And so all of these formations right across here will actually all bumped up 20 million years to fall in line with the dates for the Ishian formation. That's the entire Jehiel group, not just the sedimentary groups, but the whole entire sedimentary formations that contain the Jehiel biota. All of them were redated, and all of them were made younger by 20 million years. Now, let me just say here, I'm not saying that radiometric dating is bogus. I'm not saying that. I do think there is validity to some radiometric dating, and I think that validity has to do with relative dating. The RATE project clearly seemed to suggest that there has been hundreds of millions of years of radioisotope decay. I'm not saying that. That's what they said. Go and read their material. There are a bunch of creationist scientists, geophysicists, etc., that did a whole bunch of research on this, and they basically said, look, yes, when you look at the rocks in the geologic record, the ones down the bottom certainly seem to be older than the ones in the middle, and these ones in the middle seem to be older than the ones at the top. In other words, there seems to be a general progression in the geologic record where hundreds of millions of years worth of decay has occurred. And what creationists think happened is that either at the fall or at some stage during the flood, radioisotope decay got sped up. And so those dates are off by hundreds of millions of years. And there is some evidence to support that. Again, go back and read that rate material to have a look at that evidence. There is some evidence to support those conclusions, as well as a multitude of other evidences that do support those conclusions. Things like the series that I've done on coelacanth, the living fossils. How do you get basically the same taxa at the level of a genus, essentially, not changing for 400 billion years? How do you get soft tissues in dinosaur bones? Why do you not get huge amounts of bioerosion and bioturbation in sediments that are supposedly millions of years old? There are lots of these other kinds of evidences as well that do seem to cast great doubt on the hundreds of millions of years given by radiometric dates. But in general, I do want to say I think I agree with the RATE project, and that is that hundreds of millions of years of radiometric decay has occurred, which means those geochemical signatures do seem to be in the rocks, and I can understand why an evolutionist would look at those geochemical signatures and place a date on it. However, having said all of that, the RATE project did show there seemed to be a lot of discordance with a lot of these dates. So I don't think they're as accurate as what an evolutionist would think. I think there's a lot of room for movement, and I think that the evolutionists may tend to pick their dates depending what they really think the age of that formation is in the first place. But I do think there is some variation that is there, but it's within limits. They certainly couldn't say, for example, if the Ishian formation, they had a date of 125 million years, they couldn't turn around and say, oh, this is now 50 million years old, or no, it's now 200 million years old. Anyway, after all of that, after saying all of that, I really do struggle with accepting the dates as given in the literature for these four groups right here. It turns out that if you go with the older dates that they had back in the mid to late 90s, these four groups drop down to here. And guess what? That puts them at exactly the same time as the compsognathids. It puts everything in the late Jurassic. Now that is really interesting, because this is not what you would expect from an evolutionary perspective. You would not expect to find all of these evolutionary modified forms together in the same, essentially the same sediments. You would not expect that. If we use those older dates for the J-hole biota, then we end up with a very interesting picture where all of these taxa essentially turn up at the same time. And that's really interesting. So I think that here's a great creationist project for someone to go back and really look at the data and all of the papers on what's going on with the dates for all of these formations out there in China. What's going on with the Jurassic Cretaceous boundary dates? That really needs to get sorted out before we can firmly say this is the case. That doesn't have to be the case. I think given what I've just said, I think you could say this is the case as well, and that is problematic from a evolutionary perspective. Okay, so that's the end of part 2. In part 3, we are going to look at the final real issue here, and that is sort of the continuity that we do see in the fossils. So even though, and what we've looked at the fact that there is no evidence for the evolution of the feather before Anchiornis. We've seen that essentially feathered flight just turns up in the fossil record. We've also seen that when it comes to the evolutionary sequence from dino to bird, essentially all of the fossils turn up in the fossil record at the same time. That is something that accords more with a creationist interpretation than an evolutionary one. But then the next question is the continuity. So although, let me go back to this, where are we? Right back here. Although we've seen that the fossils don't quite play the way they are supposed to play in an evolutionary situation, there does seem to be some continuity here. You know, when you look at them in this form, in the artist rendition, but also when you look at the skeletal representations, which I just had here. So here is Sinosauropteryx, here is Anchiornis, here is Confuciusornis, here is an enantiornithine, and here's a chicken. And if I was an evolutionist, I could see why the evolutionary story would seem to make sense. It looks like there is sort of a transition going on here. Now, if you put flesh on these things, they're very different from each other. For example, we've got a skeleton of a chicken, but you could take the skeleton of any number of birds today, and they're very, very similar to each other, the skeletons are, but when you put the flesh on, you can see they're very different from each other. And so you've got to keep that in mind. When you put the flesh on these organisms, it does make them very different. But from a creationist perspective, there does seem to be some continuity going on with the bones, okay? And I do want to look at that and talk about that in part 3. So that finishes part 2. Look, if you were in any way blessed by this video, then please go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe, ring the bell. I've got other resources at the website, www.creationunfolding.com. Of course, if you want to support, I do have a PayPal button now in the description. Go ahead and click that if you want to support me financially. That would be greatly appreciated. But of course, the greatest support that you could give, it's easy, you can do it right now, is just to stop for a minute and pray for me. I'd really appreciate that. Okay, thank you and goodbye.